This is part 3 of How Do You Handle Grief? If you haven't watched part 1 and 2, I urge you to do so. In Ephesians 4:1, Paul says, I implore you to walk in a manner worthy. The word walk refers to your behavior. Your walk, your way, your manner, or habit of behavior. Edith's behavior was very important to God. In Ephesians 4:17, Paul says, walk no longer. It's a command to change. Edith has got to change to please God. But Edith said she didn't know how to change. Well, the good news is Paul gives her the how-to in verses 22, 23, and 24. In Ephesians 4:17, it commands Edith, or rather, in Ephesians 4:17 commands Edith with regards to excessive grieving. Edith, you must change. I tell Edith that everything I'm going to say will be in the context of grief. In Ephesians 4:22, Paul says that in reference to your former manner of life, you lay aside the old self which is being corrupted in accordance with the lust of deceit. Lay aside or put off the habit of grieving. And then verse 23, and that you be renewed in the spirit of your mind. In other words, you've got to think biblically, not psychologically about grief. You know, we Christians think biblically about everything else. But then when it comes to behavior, anger, bitterness, envy, jealousy, greed, immorality, or depression or anxiety, and grief, off comes the biblical glasses and on comes the psychological glasses. And we cease being biblical any longer. Edith needs to change her thinking about grief. She needs to quit thinking psychologically and think biblically. And finally, verse 23, or verse 24, and put on the new self, which is in the likeness of God, has been created in righteousness and holiness of truth. Notice this principle of putting off the sinful habit and putting on the biblical alternative. He gives us an example in verse 25. He says, therefore, laying aside falsehood. In other words, lay aside, put off falsehood, lying. Now, we've all lied. However, we're not all habituated to lying where it complicates our life and relationships. Do you see the put off? Therefore, laying aside falsehood. Put off the habit of lying. Notice the put on. Speak truth to one another, etc. Now we see these put offs and put ons everywhere. For example, in Philippians 2:3, Paul says, do nothing from selfishness. Put off selfishness. Now, we've all behaved selfishly at some time. However, you're not habituated to selfishness to where it complicates your life and relationships. You know people habituated to selfishness. For example, your spouse says, I really enjoy going out with Frank and Donna. They're fun to be with. And you say, I do too. They are fun. But Frank is such a selfish person. People are known by their sinful habits. I said to Edith, Psalm 119 verse 11 tells us to hide the word in our heart that we might not sin against God. What verse did Edith need to hide in her heart? She needed to hide in her heart her put off and put on verse. To hide a verse in one's heart means to memorize the verse. The verse I assigned to Edith was 1 Samuel 16:1. Here's what it said. Now the Lord said to Samuel, how long will you grieve over Saul, since I have rejected him from being king over Israel? Fill your horn with oil and go. I will send you to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have selected a king for myself from among his sons. Edith's put off was 1 Samuel 16:1a. Now the Lord said to Samuel, how long will you grieve? The put off is grief. The put on is 1 Samuel 16:1b. Fill your horn with oil and go. God told Samuel to stop grieving and do what he commanded him to do. Go, God said, I will send you to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have selected a king for myself from among his sons. So Edith must put on what God obligated her to do, like Samuel. She needs to, in a sense, fill her horn with oil and go. In other words, take biblical action. Edith must change her behavior, practice it, and thus putting off excessive and habitual grief. We find the same principle throughout Scripture. David wrote about excessive fretting or brooding in Psalm 37. A person that has become habituated to fretting or brooding, in other words, repetitive thinking, that's what it is. A person that broods sits and thinks about something over and over. For example, a person will brood because they feel that someone mistreated them. The put off is Psalm 37:1a. Do not fret. Notice it's a command to change. It is a sin to brood and fret. The put on is Psalm 37:3a. Trust in the Lord and do good. The change of behavior that must be put into practice is described in the words, do good. What good should the counselee do? The counselee who has become immobilized by excessive brooding is to do whatever God holds him or her obligated to do that they're not doing because they are sitting on the sofa brooding and fretting. The same is taught by the Apostle Paul in 2 Corinthians 4:1. It tells about how after Paul's conversion he experienced many hardships and difficulties. In 2 Corinthians chapters 4, 6, and 11, there's a list of the terrible hardships and persecutions Paul experienced. Beatings, imprisonments, hunger, shipwreck, and so on. After you read that list, you would think to yourself, wow, if anyone ought to be sitting at home brooding and fretting, it ought to be Paul. However, Paul did not fall into the habit of depression and anger and grief and brooding or fretting. Why not? He tells us in chapter 4, verse 1, therefore, since we have this ministry, as we receive mercy, we do not lose heart. Losing heart is becoming depressed. The reason is that Paul focused on what God obligated him to do. In other words, his ministry. Paul was duty-bound to keep his commitment to God and neighbor. He never entertained the idea, as many do today, that he was now emotionally damaged, traumatized, and incapable of doing what God required him to do. Paul did not yield and practice grief or brooding. In Philippians chapter 3, verse 13, Paul says, brethren, I do not regard myself as having laid hold of it yet, but one thing I do. He says, forgetting what lies behind, reaching forward to what lies ahead. One thing I do. Notice, Paul took action. Now, Paul didn't literally forget the hardships and difficulties of the past. Paul did not brood and dwell on the past. No, Paul focused on his obligations to God and neighbor. Paul said he reached forward to what lied ahead. What lied ahead of Paul? Whatever God obligated him to do, he obeyed. He didn't allow himself to become habituated to brooding and grief. In a classic passage on anxiety, Paul said the key to excessive worry or anxiety was to focus on his godly duties. In Philippians 4:6, you'll remember this. Do not be anxious about anything, But in everything by prayer and pleading with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known by God. When I ask a counselee what they're doing about their problem, they typically say, praying. But you see, there's more to do than just pray. In verse 8, he goes on and says, finally, brothers and sisters, whatever is true, honorable, right, pure, lovely, whatever is good, change the focus of your thinking. Take control of your thoughts. How do you do that? By changing your behavior. Then finally in verse 9, he says, as for the things you have learned and received and heard and seen in me, practice these things, and the God of peace will be with you. Change your behavior and practice it to form a new habit.